for traveling in the North Country Fair.
They say no one wants to hear what a kid wrote last month.
Well, I like your songs.
Where the winds hit heavy on the borderline.
Okay, Timothy, what was one aspect about Bob Dylan that was maybe a little bit slower for you to grasp, but then once you did, you knew it would work?
I would say it was all slow until it wasn't, and there was so much encompassing this young man's career, but I had so much time. In a sense, I had 5.5 years to work on this, and also no deadline, no pressure to present something at any point until it was time to shoot, where I worked on it forever, that it was sort of absent the deadlines that you get on another project where you have 3 months or a month to prepare, you know?
Oh, yeah. That's great. And Elle, your character is based off of Suze Rotolo. What from her memoir really impacted your portrayal of her, and then what parts of yourself did you add to make Sylvie a truly original character?
I don't know if I ever consciously put parts of myself into a character. I mean, I think there is something about their relationship that everyone can relate to, because I think everyone can relate to having a first love and the innocence of that. But yeah, I mean, from her memoir, it was helpful in a lot of ways of just encapsulating that time. I mean, and also fleshing out who she was on her own. You know, I think I was very conscious of not wanting her to just be the partner, the girlfriend part. And so reading about her, you know, involvement in the politics of the 60s and her paintings and her as an artist in her own right, like that helped me to flesh her out to make her a full person, because she's really the only person in the film that isn't famous or people don't necessarily know. So I had to, it's not like I had a lot of material to build off of, so I had to kind of start from the ground up with that, really.
Now, I love the costuming and hair and makeup in this. It's so detailed. I mean, down to the dirt under Bob's fingernails.
Long fingernails.
Yes, I definitely noticed that.
But he did have them. I mean, he had to grow them out.
And they got stronger over time.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, they would chip at first, but I don't know, that must be some bodily process, like your body just gets used to. And by the end, they were like claws.
Oh, yeah, you could get, you know, a full set at the end of the...
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
That's so funny. But was there one particular costume piece that made you really feel like your character? And then what was the moment when you first two saw each other in character for the first time and reactions to that?
Well, to the first part, I feel like the part of the movie that's 63 to 65, Bob's clothes are new, in a sense, so they didn't have to feel so broken down and aged. But through the beginning, Ariane, our costume designer, I was constantly begging her, please beat these clothes up and really age them, because it's sort of a pet peeve of mine when I watch biopics or old things, when, you know, clothes feel like they were pulled out of a storage locker and they feel kind of like crisp and new in some sense. And so I was just, you know, if Bob Dylan looked up to Woody Guthrie and Hank Williams and these sort of like gods of folk music, his stuff would be beat up, you know. He didn't have a reputation for being orderly at the time. So that's what I remember from the clothes up top.
Yeah, I had like this fuzzy jacket, furry jacket that was like suede, and I think Ariane had said that we had read that Bob gifted that to Suze, who Sylvie's based on, so that was a little homage to that. And there is a picture of Suze like walking with Bob in a jacket that looks very similar.
Oh,
yeah.
And how about your reaction to seeing Timothy as Bob for the first time?
I was thinking because, so I saw him perform on stage, like on set, but then really like the first time we saw each other if you're talking about like costumes and character, we had to shoot the Freewheelin' album cover, like recreation.
That's true.
Yeah, and that was before we started filming. It was like a, you know, pre-day, and we would like take a couple steps, go back. I mean, we weren't in character, but we were in costume, fully trying to emulate the cold, and it wasn't cold that day. We had to pretend to be cold walking down the street. Yeah.
That's really cute. I love that.
I was struck by her hair color because I'd only known Elle as Elle,
I mean, I wore 2 wigs, but...
You both looked great. You both looked great. Timothy, what makes Bob such a legend, and where were you when you saw his tweet in support of you playing him?
Yeah, well, there's many smart person that could describe why he's a legend better than me, but a short answer is just his contribution to American culture, his lyricism, his poetry, what he represented and represents to the 60s and to a whole generation of artists that he inspired to this day, which is the humble hope of the movies that will introduce him and these other characters to a whole new audience. That post, I've been corrected to say that it's not a tweet.
Oh, yeah, I
right,
know.
Right?
X. Oh,
yes.
Right? What is...
It's a tweet. It's a tweet.
You know, that we can combine and say that twost. That
Yeah,
twost
there you go.
was, you know, I was absolutely floored. Like I said, I really couldn't come up with the word, so I just figured to use the word that I actually felt was floored, you know?
Yeah.
It's like someone I never imagined putting an energy of affirmation out there. And that's how I'm going to take it. That's how I'm going to cherish it. Unless he deletes it. In which case,
We have
You don't say
screenshots.
tweet, what do you say?
you say post.
Post.
Post. Oh,
Yeah.
I didn't even know that. Okay.
Were any of the guitars that you played actually Bob's guitars at all?
No, and fun
No?
fact, the one he played at Newport in '65, I think I'm correct here, he left on a plane and there was like a contentious auction sale, like in the last decade or something, where many people laid claim to the guitar, and they, you know, it was one of these things where they put it up for auction and
Yeah.
it was never really clear how...
If it really was hit
No, it
or
was.
not. Oh,
it was,
they knew
but
it
they
was
didn't know
it?
how they. No one knew how the person had gotten their hands.
Oh, no.
That's my understanding of it. I don't
Okay.
want to throw any
Wow.
grenades that aren't. But
But you kept some of the guitars, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you kept
Oh,
them all.
nice. How many did you keep?
2.
2. And were they of that era? Because I know some of the microphones were like period
They
microphones.
were recreated of that era in the sense that they don't make those guitars anymore, and they sound great.
You tramped all the way from Minnesota. Why is that?
I wanted to catch a spark.
I loved your performance as Pete Seeger.
Oh, thanks.
You truly just, it was seamless. But I wanted to know, he kind of has like a Mr. Rogers-like persona about him, but then he's also at the same time a rebel. You know, we see him in the courtroom scene standing up for free speech. So how did you balance out those two parts of his character in your performance?
So it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because when I watched Pete Seeger's folk show, which you see a little taste of when Bob comes to visit him in the humble little, it was called Rainbow Quest. When I watched it, I thought, this is so much like an adult Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And then I found out that Mr. Rogers was a big fan of Pete Seeger's.
Really?
And it's almost certain that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was in fact very
Wow.
influenced by Pete Seeger's show. But yes, I think you're right. I think he had a gentleness to him. He had a very genuine capacity for bringing people together, and you know, for being loving and promoting brotherhood and sisterhood. And you know, he really was that guy. I say sometimes he reminds you of kind of a Jesuit, like like someone who's really not in it for the money, who's eschews money and fame and all of it, and really is driven by purpose. So he really was that kind of a person. And when you talk to people who knew him, it's almost universal. You can't find anyone who essentially doesn't feel the same way about him. There's kind of a reverence for him. But I also agree, you're right, he was very provocative. He was gentle, but he was very provocative, very demanding in terms of standing up to power. And some of those things he said in the court, he really said, he said, my songs aren't un-American. It is un-American to ask a person that question. And you know, he was pretty toothy when he took on what he considered to be institutional abuse, you know?
What do you think it was about Bob Dylan that Pete Seeger admired the most? Because I feel like your portrayal, it was almost like a paternal feeling towards him.
Yeah, or an older brother.
Exactly.
I do feel, people will interpret, if we've done this right, I think you want to leave room for anybody to interpret it any way they want. You know, what the nature of that relationship is, because people have different kinds of mentorship. There are parents, there are older brothers, there are people who are just comrades. And that can be among doctors, it can be among teachers. I think there's a universality to that idea of admiration, obligation, support, resistance. You know, these things are kind of, they're the tensions and the paradoxes in relationships and people in any field, not just musicians or artists. But I think that, I think when you understand what a tough 10 years Pete Seeger went through in the 50s with the blacklist, the anti-communist kind of Red Scare period, I think you begin to understand why it was so thrilling for people of his generation to see folk music and their message rising up out of the suppression of the 50s and really blooming in this period. And there are these pictures that Jim and I were very focused on of Dylan playing on the stage and Pete Seeger sitting sometimes in the wings, looking at him with this expression on his face that is just, it's joy. You can't, there's nothing you can say about it except joy, and you sense in him an emotion of feeling that the seeds they have planted are flowering in a new generation, and it's really very touching. You know?
Yeah, it was, and you did such a brilliant job at that. That's exactly how I felt watching Pete watch Bob Dylan, you know, and but I really thought that this was a true ensemble cast. Like, everyone's performance was so seamless. But for you, when you were on set, was there one particular moment where you saw Timothée Chalamet as Bob Dylan and you're like, that is a true moment of transformation right there?
There were many. I mean, not one. I had that feeling of almost kind of eerie sense that we were in this weird little time warp, and that the ghosts of it all were kind of shimmering around us. I felt, I mean, right, the first scene I did with him is the scene they met in the hospital, and that song for Woody is one I know really, really well. And I thought right from the drop, like, we were in a very exciting experience with Timmy and that incarnation of him that he was creating. I think, I admired everything about the depth that he went into it with, just enormously.
Totally.
Wonderful work.
The depth that you went to not only learn how to play the banjo in a couple of months, but learn how to play the banjo like Pete Seeger, you know? So what was it like learning to play the banjo for this film? And is it something that you think you'll continue on now that it's wrapped?
No, I'll probably go back to my guitars, which I have a long, loving relationship with, and the banjo, banjo's like an alien. It's like an affair that I've had now, and I think I appreciate it, but I'm not sure I'm ever going to be a virtuoso on it. But I was lucky to have had enough of a musical grounding that it wasn't, I wasn't starting from scratch, but I do music in general, and certainly the music that people like Pete Seeger make look effortless. In some ways, it really is true that the deeper you go, the more you realize that it's an infinite horizon. And he was such a virtuoso. Even the professionals that we worked with on the arrangements and things acknowledged that some of the stuff he did is very, very hard even for professionals to imitate. So we had to be very clever in figuring out the way to make it look like we were doing it at his level.
By any chance, were any of the banjos in the film one of Pete Seeger's banjos that he's played? Yes.
We had multiples of his famous long neck banjo, but that and the 12-string guitar that I have and were are old ones of his that were held in trust by one of his producers in Beacon, New York, who amazingly lent them to us. So it was very special.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Going back to that beautiful moment with Woody Guthrie in the first part of the film, you know, it's obviously we see just a deep respect for him that both Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger had. So what was it about Woody that, you know, Pete respected so much, and how did that inform your portrayal of Pete?
I think that the way that, you know, Jim he carries you into this film with the sound of Woody Guthrie's voice. I mean, it is actually in and out. You know what I mean? And I think that it's hard to overstate for those people. Woody, if Pete Seeger was sort of the Gandalf of that time, or the high priest, Woody Guthrie was almost divine to those people. He represented Americana and the American folk spirit in a mystical way to a lot of those people. And I think that the way that Jim's architected this story, I think he conveys that was it was almost like a shared devotion among the people at that time. And yet it's so wild, because I think he was in this there he was in this hospital in New Jersey. And It's one of the great amazements. There's a couple things that I still can't really wrap my head around. One is that Bob Dylan, as almost a boy, made his way across the country and actually did encounter his druid like that. And it almost has that like devil at the crossroads kind of thing where it was like he was anointed or something. I also think it's amazing that Pete Seeger, who his friend, Woody Guthrie, writes This Land Is Your Land, this iconic American song of patriotism but protest and so laced under it. And through the civil rights movement and through the Vietnam era and all of it, Pete Seeger is still alive in his 90s and plays that song at Barack Obama's inauguration with Bruce Springsteen. You know, the span of that. And when you think about the span of his friend writing that song in the Depression and him playing it at the inauguration of the first black president is just
beautiful.
It's astonishing. Yeah, it's you couldn't make that up.
Miles in the mouth of a graveyard, and it's a heart, oh, it's a heart.
You were amazing in this film, and you totally transformed into Joan Baez. So what was the most important aspect to finding Joan in your portrayal of her?
Well, initially, the most important thing to me was getting the music training that I needed to believably play her at the place that we meet her in the film. Because in the beginning of the film, she's, at the height of her career, and she's world-renowned on the cover of Time, and she's known for having an exceptional voice and an incredible ability to play the guitar. And I did neither of those things, or had neither of those things. So initially it was just like, putting my head down and getting into training musically.
Yeah. Did you get a lot of calluses on the fingers from practicing
They're
so
still
much?
numb, actually. I mean, I still play, but yeah. Yeah, that was a lot.
Is there a potential music career for you ahead? I've heard that you've been writing some original songs. Maybe you want to keep this thing up.
Yeah, I mean, I've been. The beauty of this film is it did really awaken a part of me that I think I've always wanted to explore. I've always wanted to learn to play the guitar. I had a ukulele, and I'd sing to myself. And the gift of this film was all of the training that I did and the beautiful coaches that I got to work with. And I think that made me feel like some part of that was possible. It's still very much a private thing, I'm just sort of exploring it like in the mornings or just when I see my guitar and want to, tune away from the other work, I guess. So I don't know about making it a career, but it is something that I now have a relationship with that I really appreciate.
Well, you certainly have a fan here if that's something that you started. So I know that you actually got to talk to Joan on the phone, which must have been amazing. So after speaking with her, what makes Joan Baez such an icon, and what were your impressions of her after talking with her on the phone?
I think just one of the really cool things about Joan is that she's just always been really honest about herself. She's very forthcoming in her memoirs and in documentaries. She doesn't try to make herself sound like a hero. She's just really tapped into her own truth. And I felt like, that definitely was the same case when we were speaking on the phone, and I think that's a part of what makes her so magical. Of course, there are iconic qualities of her voice and that angelic thing, the vibrato, her guitar skills, all of those things are really incredible. But I think what makes her so special is just, I think, how she sees the world and how she sees herself and her relationship with authenticity. And so I felt very lucky to get to speak to her and sort of just solidify that impression of her in my head.
Absolutely. Have you, by any chance, spoken with her since? I know Bob Dylan gave his approval for the film. Did maybe she shoot you a little nod of approval?
We haven't spoken since.
Okay.
After we spoke, she drew a couple of pictures and texted them to me. I guess I could text her if I wanted to. I think for now we had this moment where I forget what I was saying, but it was some kind of like something just out of respect. And she was just sort of like, I'm just in my backyard listening to the birds. And I mean, that was just such a Joan response to this whole thing. I think she exists as herself, and she doesn't live or die by what we say in this movie. And she's not waiting for any kind of approval from anybody. And so I've just sort of felt like letting this play out on its own and letting her have the space to absorb it in whatever way she wants to, while I also process and try to understand what we've done here, is the best course of action for now. I mean, sure, somewhere down the line I would love to have a longer conversation with her.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Now, you talked about your duetting with Timothée being a career highlight for you. Yeah. So what was it that stuck with you about his singing voice and then the harmonies that you guys made together?
I mean, he put so much work into getting the Bob sound. And I knew about that as we were going, and I heard his pre-records and I sang along to them in the studio. And I was always hearing about, what he was doing. And it just was a really exciting moment to get to show up and trust our musical proficiency at that point. And I hear the sound of our voices together. I mean, that just was, it's a kind of magic that I think musicians are really lucky to experience, and I had never experienced before. And, yeah, I mean, Nick Baxter designed beautiful harmonies, and the guitar accompaniment just flowed so beautifully, and it was kind of a transcendent experience.
And how about the first time that you saw Timothée as Bob Dylan? What was that moment like for you, and what were your first impressions seeing him?
I mean, it just fit. I mean, when I met him, he was in a sort of partial version of costume. So it's funny to sort of see him on the backside. I feel like I'm now meeting Timmy, not because he was, method or anything, but it just was. We just sort of launched into it already pretty deeply in our characters. I mean, I wore my own clothes, but it just, I don't know. We were already both very sort of deeply ingrained in the job. There was a moment in his screen test where I looked and looked again, because to me it looked like, I was like, that looks like Bob. And so, that's just a testament to Timmy's work, of course, and his body language, and then also Ariane, beautiful costume designer, and the hair and makeup, and yeah.
I stumbled on the side of 12 misty mountains. I walked and I crawled on 6 crooked highways.
You've already made one beloved musical biopic with Walk the Line, but what was it about Bob Dylan during this time period specifically that called to you as a filmmaker?
The questions the story raised, that were even beyond just Bob. I mean, obviously it comes with all that great music, so that's an incredible asset. It's almost like having Bob Dylan as a co-writer with me and Jay, in the sense that he's supplying so much of the text himself. But but it's, as I said, it's the questions that the story raised. It's like, because it's kind of, Bob's story in those first years in New York is kind of a fairy tale, or kind of almost a Dickens story of this kind of man with no name landing in town with a few pennies in his pocket and a moleskin notebook with a few lyrics scrawled in it and a guitar case, ostensibly to meet his hero in a VA hospital dying of Huntington's disease, where he sings him a song and kind of becomes discovered by Pete Seeger, who starts him in clubs, and within 2 years is leading the folk movement and about to start a kind of rock and roll revolution. And that ascendancy, and at the same time that we're talking about a young man's years between 19 and 23 years old, writing 30 of the most important songs of the century. It became an opportunity, I thought, to make a kind of Amadeus in the music world, in the folk music and rock music world, in which, you know, that movie, if you remember it, or it was also a play, it doesn't try to figure out how Mozart comes up with this music, but it follows the wake or the effect that this kind of genius has on the circle of people around him. And I think that's why the supporting performances in our movie are so strong, because whether it's Elle Fanning, who plays his first girlfriend Sylvie, or it's Joan Baez, who plays his sometimes lover and collaborator, or it's Pete Seeger, who's like a older brother or father figure. Each of these people has their own agenda for Bob, and their own hopes and dreams for him, and each of them is either disappointed or inspired in different ways and at different points. And the idea of kind of a superpower or a talent or a genius is a really interesting one, and it raises so many questions for us, but it also raises the questions of what does it feel like to be the person with that power? And, you know, Bob himself would say to me, he doesn't really know where all those songs came from. They just kind of came. And so what does it feel like when that power also separates you from people, makes you feel more alone, makes you feel that everyone wants something from you or expects you to do what they hope for as opposed to what you're interested in? And so many of those questions are applicable even to us today. They're not specifically about Bob Dylan, although they certainly were. And also, lastly, the kind of tribalization, because we have that now in our culture, you know, this kind of like you're either with us or against us kind of feeling. And Bob, all his life, has been so resistant to getting put on one box or one team.
Absolutely, yeah. And to your point, the cast was just so incredible. It truly was an ensemble.
Yeah.
But was there one moment for you on set specifically when you felt that Timothy had truly transformed into Bob Dylan?
Oh yeah, it was the first week we were shooting, and you saw the movie, right?
Yes,
so, yeah,
of course.
Yeah, we did the scene where he sings a song he wrote for Woody Guthrie to Woody Guthrie in his hospital bed. And Timmy sang that song live, and he had been steadily improving and growing for years, prepping for the movie. But what he did that night was so magical. And I remember shooting this one close-up of him, and just, he was 2/3 the way through the song, and I was just astounded with the intensity of what he was doing. And I was just praying he'd make it through the take, because I knew not only did I have the scene, but there's weird signposts in a movie where you kind of know, if I can get this, I have the movie. You know what I mean? And that scene is so important because obviously it's the inciting incident of his whole career. But also in relation to my audience, our audience watching the movie, it's also important in a whole nother way, because you come into the movie and you're like, I don't know, am I going to believe this? I don't know if I'm going to believe him as this guy, right? That's the normal skepticism of an audience member. You come in and you're not sure that the filmmaker and the actors are going to come through, right? So, and that's a scene where I could see him literally go, yeah, I am coming through.
I love that. No,
Yeah.
it definitely was the catalyst for everything. And
Yeah.
and I think having it be live just added that extra texture to it. And there's so many live musical performances in this film. What was
There
your
are.
approach to shooting those scenes? And why did you feel like they needed to be live?
Well, this kind of music, folk music in particular, but rock and roll also, especially when it is live, like we don't have many studio recording scenes in the movie, although some, but it's not about technical perfection. It's not about production level. It's not about arrangements of strings or synth or drums. It's really about words and music and the human voice, almost raw. And I didn't know how I could make a movie about people who operate creatively in such a Spartan environment, but have earwigs in their ears and have them kind of mouthing the words to a song that either someone else sang or that they sang months ago. I felt like it kind of had to be
Yeah.
their own breathing, their own moment. and how they could bend and push and pull the song in that moment in a way that even we might not expect until it happened.
Totally. And one other element that I found super interesting was the use of vintage microphones. I know your production mixer talked about that. And it got me thinking about the vintage instruments in the movie and how many of the instruments were of that time period. I know Ed said that he actually had Pete Seeger's banjo and guitar. So
Yeah.
how many of those were period pieces? And then
Almost
which
all, I'd say,
Okay.
except for Bob's hero Gibson, I believe was because we needed multiples of the same instrument. I believe the Gibson made us a perfect replica.
Wow.
Several of that guitar, and Timmy would practice on it day and night. But many, probably almost all the instruments were the real thing, vintage instruments from the right period.
Did you have a favorite piece on set?
There's this moment he jams with Jesse Moffat, this blues musician, in a TV studio with Pete Seeger, that I love the energy between them all in that scene. But I also really love Bob and Joan Baez singing "It Ain't Me, Babe." They're so winning together.
They are.
And it's like, they have a hard time getting along when they're not singing, but when they are singing together, it's kind of this beautiful intimacy and joy you feel between them.